Greetings, cozy knights. Lower your swords and rest by the fire. Tonight, we journey through the hidden facts about Elden Ring's Ashes of War, the crystallized memories of warriors long dead, waiting for someone worthy enough to wield them. Drop a comment below and tell me where you're listening from tonight, and what games you want me to cover next, and subscribe if this helps you sleep. Memories made manifest. There is a concept woven quietly into the DNA of Elden Ring that most players feel without ever fully articulating. When you slide an Ash of War onto your blade and step into a boss arena with the skill of some long-dead warrior riding your hand, you are not simply using a technique, you are borrowing a life. The item descriptions make this explicit. Ashes of War are, in lore terms, the preserved memories of warriors who fought and died across the lands between, not mere imitations of their skills. Their actual memories, distilled somehow into these small, glowing fragments. The act of equipping one is the act of inheritance. You carry something that was once a living being's most intimate expertise, and you use it as though it were always yours. The system born from Dark Souls. Elden Ring did not invent the concept of equipable weapon skills, but it did something the series had never quite managed before. It made them freely transferable. In Dark Souls 3, weapon arts existed and they were meaningful, but they were bound to specific weapons. If you wanted a particular move, you carried that weapon. Elden Ring broke that constraint wide open. Now, an Ash of War can be slid off one weapon and onto another of the same compatible type with zero friction or cost, and you can do it as many times as you like at any site of grace. This one design choice fundamentally changed how players engage with their entire arsenal. It means every infusible weapon in the game is, in some sense, a canvas. Lost Ashes of War. One of the stranger and more quietly haunting items in the game is the Lost Ash of War, and its item description reads, in part, empty ashes of war, devoid of any memories of battle. The implication there is worth sitting with for a moment. A normal Ash of War is full of the memory, the skill, the ghost of technique left behind by someone who once lived and fought. A lost Ash of War has been emptied. It is a vessel that once held something real, stripped bare. And yet, when you bring it to Smithing Master Hewg at the Round Table Hold and ask him to use it to copy another ash, the description concludes with a sentence that stops you cold. Thus does the copy pass into becoming the genuine article. The duplicate is not a lesser version. Hewg apparently can breathe real memory back into emptiness. Smithing Master Hewg and the Round Table. Hold. Hewg sits at his forge in the Round Table Hold, and he is there at the center of everything related to weapon modification. He is the one who can apply Ashes of War to your weapons when you speak to him directly, an alternative to doing it yourself at any site of grace once you carry the Whetstone Knife. What makes Hewg particularly significant in the context of Ashes of War is his role as the duplicator, the craftsman capable of reproducing a memory. His lore is melancholy in its own right. He is trapped in the Round Table, compelled by Marika's will, never permitted to leave. But his craft is ancient and profound. Every time he fuses a lost Ash of War with an existing one to create a copy, he is doing something that should, by all reasonable reckoning, be impossible, making one genuine thing into two genuine things. The Whetstone Knife beneath Gatefront ruins. The very first thing the game quietly nudges you toward, if you follow the Gracelight's direction out of the starting area, is the Gatefront ruins. And inside those ruins, down a set of stone steps guarded by Godric's soldiers, sits a chest. In that chest are two things: the Ash of War, Storm Stomp, and the Whetstone Knife. The Whetstone Knife is the keystone of the entire Ash of War system. Without it, you cannot apply or change ashes at sites of grace. Most players pick it up without fully registering what it does, because the game presents it so early and so quietly, bundled with what seems like just a minor utility item. But that little knife is, in effect, the master key to building any playstyle in the game. There is something intentional about hiding the most important systemic key underground in enemy-held ruins, at the very beginning of the world. Bloody Slash, the Ash of War. Bloody Slash carries a description that situates it clearly within the cosmology of one of Elden Ring's most disturbing demigods. It is described as a blood oath skill, granted by the Lord of Blood. The Lord of Blood is Mog, Lord of Blood, the twin of Morgoth, a shunned omen who discovered a forbidden outer god worshipped through hemorrhage and ritual scarring. The Bloody Slash is one of his gifts to those who follow his blood covenant. In practice, it requires you to coat your blade in your own blood before unleashing a wide, sweeping arc of crimson energy. The cost is your health. The reward is a devastating strike and the rapid accumulation of blood loss in whatever you hit. It drops from the blood-crazed Godric Knight guarding the walls of Fort Hate in eastern Limgrave. A knight who has clearly already given himself over to something darker than Godric's service. Seppuku. The item description for the Ash of War. Seppuku is one of the most direct and unsettling pieces of text attached to any ash in the game. It reads, "A forbidden technique used by swordsmen from the Land of Reeds." The Land of Reeds is the Elden Ring world's equivalent of feudal Japan, a distant eastern realm that sent warriors like Okina and Yura into the lands between. Seppuku, the real-world practice of ritual self-disembowelment, is translated directly into this game mechanic without euphemism. You plunge the blade into your stomach. The blood stains the weapon. Your attack power rises, your bleed buildup increases, and you pay the cost in your own health. The word forbidden in the description is never explained. We don't know who forbade it or why it carries that weight. But the fact that it was banned among the warriors of the Land of Reeds suggests it crossed some line. Perhaps it was simply too effective, too willing to trade the self for power. The invisible scarab on the frozen lake. One of the most atmospheric ways to acquire an Ash of War in the entire game is finding the Seppuku scarab on the frozen lake east of the freezing lake site of Grace, in the mountaintops of the Giants. The scarab is invisible. You cannot see it. You can only hear it, a faint skittering against ice, and follow the trails its feet press into the frost. In a game filled with stunning visual details, this particular moment of invisible enemy tracking on a silent frozen lake high in a frozen mountain range hits differently when you find it for the first time. You stand on ice, surrounded by nothing, listening, following footprints that lead you in slow circles toward a creature you cannot see, carrying the memory of a forbidden technique. It is a very deliberate piece of environmental storytelling that makes the ash feel earned in a way a chest never could. Ice Spear. The Ash of War. Ice Spear carries one of the most lore-loaded descriptions of any ash in the game, simple as it is. Skill of the warriors who served Lunar Princess Ranni. This matters more than it might initially seem. Ranni the Witch is one of the most significant characters in all of Elden Ring. The demigod who orchestrated the Night of Black Knives, who shed her own body, who sought to remove herself and her followers from the Golden Order's golden cage entirely. The warriors who served her wielded cold magic, spinning it into spears of ice. When the knight's cavalry in southern Leonia drops this ash, it begs a question the game never answers directly. Why does a patrol working under Morgoth's authority carry a skill explicitly belonging to Ranni's forces? The most coherent interpretation is exactly what fan scholars have argued. The knight's cavalry were enforcers who hunted traitors, and Ranni was a traitor. They collected the techniques of those they killed. Phantom Slash, the Ash of War. Phantom Slash has a description that quietly reframes everything you know about the knight's cavalry. Skill inspired by the fond remembrances of the knight's cavalry. Creates an apparition of the knight's former instructor who guides a joint lunging upward swing. Their former instructor. The knight's cavalry lore confirms that the cavalrymen were once led by Margit, the fell omen, delivering death to great warriors, knights, and champions across the lands between. It is Margit's fond memory that inspired this very technique, and what the apparition summons is the ghost of that instructor mid-lunge. Margit, of course, is Morgoth in disguise, the last Elden Lord's son operating in a false form as a wandering enforcer of the old order. The image of the monstrous masked fell omen, once instructing elite mounted death riders, is never shown in the game. It lives only in this Ash of War's description, and only if you connect the dots between the Phantom Slash text and the Knight's Cavalry's confirmed lore. Royal Knight's Resolve. Deep inside Volcano Manor, through a secret passage behind an imp statue, sits a Teardrop scarab carrying the Ash of War. Royal Knight's Resolve. Its description reads, skill of the knights who once served the Elden Lord. Hold the flat of the armament to your face and pledge your resolve, greatly powering up your next attack. The emphasis on once served is the detail worth pausing over. These were Godfrey's knights, the warriors of the age when a living Elden Lord ruled, before the shattering, before grace was withdrawn, before the world unraveled. Their gesture of pledging resolve, pressing the flat of the blade to their face in a moment of solemn commitment, is the last echo of an order that no longer exists. You borrow it in Volcano Manor, a den of assassins and outcasts, which only amplifies the quiet tragedy embedded in the technique. Sacred Order. There is a Teardrop scarab northwest of the abandoned coffin's site of grace in southern Altus Plateau that drops the Ash of War, Sacred Order. The description calls it the skill of the Golden Order fundamentalist knights. These were the true believers, the soldiers of the Church's most hardline doctrine, who administered holy violence in service of the greater will. The skill itself involves performing a salute and infusing your weapon with holy essence. It is functionally a ritual act of dedication before combat. It is fascinating that this gesture, this brief, specific soldierly salute, survived long enough to be preserved as an Ash of War even as the Golden Order itself crumbled and the Elden Ring shattered. The motion outlasted the ideology. Waves of Darkness. Astal, natural-born of the Void, is one of the most visually striking bosses in Elden Ring. A vast alien horror born in what the game describes as a lightless void far away. Its remembrance description tells us it once destroyed an eternal city and stole away their sky, a catastrophe that reshaped the underground world permanently. It commands gravity and void in equal measure. When you claim the remembrance of the natural born and exchange it at the Round Table Hold, one of the rewards is the Ash of War, Waves of Darkness, which lets you plunge your weapon into the ground and release 3 cascading waves of darkness that erupt outward. This is not the memory of a warrior in any traditional sense. Astal is not a knight, not a human, not even a creature of the lands between. This is the preserved echo of something that descended from beyond the known cosmos, something the Golden Order could never have predicted or prepared for. Wielding it means borrowing a combat memory from an alien intelligence. They only come out at night. The Knight's Cavalry are encountered the first time by most players as a sudden, terrifying presence on a dark road. A mounted knight in black armor with a flail that glistens with something wet, appearing as if from nowhere once the sun has gone down. They operate on a simple rule. They exist only in darkness. When dawn comes, they vanish entirely. Rest at a site of grace to force night, and they reappear at their patrol routes, cycling endlessly through their dark vigil. There are 10 of them scattered across the lands between, each guarding a different road, each carrying a different ash of war. The rule of appearing only at night is never fully explained in-game, but it frames them as something distinctly supernatural. Not soldiers stationed along roads, but presences that the daylight world cannot hold. Margit led them. Everything sinister about the Knight's Cavalry becomes sharper when you understand their chain of command. They were led by Margit the Fell Omen, which is to say, by Morgoth of Leyndell, the last remaining demigod son of Marika, operating in a disguised form. Morgoth, who despised Tarnished and all those who would claim the Elden Ring, set his elite cavalry to work as nighttime executioners, hunting down great warriors, knights, and champions. The Phantom/Ash of War confirms that they held their instructor in deep affection. Fond remembrances is the precise phrase. These were not faceless soldiers following orders. They revered the creature that trained them. The fact that their beloved teacher was secretly one of the most powerful demigods alive, wearing a mask of aged mortality, is a layer of lore that the Knight's Cavalry themselves almost certainly never knew. The ash as trophy of the slain. One of the more compelling questions about the Knight's Cavalry is why they drop such varied and thematically inconsistent ashes of war, techniques that don't match their own fighting style at all. The cavalryman in Leonia, who drops Iset Spear, carries a skill explicitly described as belonging to Ranni's warriors, and the Knight's Cavalry lore confirms that Morgoth considered Ranni a traitor. Based on what we know about the Knight's Cavalry's role as Morgoth's enforcers, it seems reasonable that the Ice Spear was collected from a Carian warrior they defeated in their service. The cavalryman in Caelid carries Poison Moth Flight, a technique suited to the rock-corrupted south. The one in Altus carries Sacred Order, a Golden Order technique, which raises its own questions about who in that region they were sent to hunt. Each ash of war they carry could be read as a record of past engagements, a skill pulled from a fallen enemy and kept as a trophy. The game never states this outright, but the pattern across all 10 patrols is consistent enough to suggest it's something the designers intended. Giant Hunt. The Ash of War. Giant Hunt is dropped by the Knight's Cavalry in northern Leonia, north of the Bellum Church site of Grace. Its description is brief and functional. Skill developed for confronting gigantic foes. Step forward from a low stance, carrying the momentum into a sudden upward thrust. What the description doesn't tell you is how viscerally effective this technique is at staggering large enemies. The upward momentum generated by the low stance step creates a lift that is specifically calibrated for anatomy that sits well above the human scale. This is not a technique developed through abstract theory. This is something that was tested repeatedly on enormous living things, by someone who survived long enough to refine it. The Knight's Cavalry who drops it presumably took it from the warrior who developed it, and that warrior presumably died elsewhere in the north, having made the technique possible through their own survival. Repeating thrust. The Knight's Cavalry in Limgrave, patrolling the bridge area near Argyll Lake North, is often one of the first of its kind that players encounter, if they survive long enough to try and hunt it. It drops the Ash of War, repeating thrust. The skill allows you to build power and then unleash a rapid chain of thrusting attacks, each one hammering through enemy defenses like a sustained pressure campaign. It is a fundamentally aggressive technique. Not a flashy single move, but a commitment to sustained assault. Its presence as the first Knight's Cavalry drop reinforces the game's philosophy of teaching by example. The very first Elite Patrol drops an Ash that teaches players that repetition and relentlessness can be just as effective as spectacle. Barricade Shield. The Knight's Cavalry in the Weeping Peninsula, patrolling near the Castle Morn Rampart site of Grace, drops the Ash of War, Barricade Shield alongside the Knight Rider flail weapon. Barricade Shield is a fascinating Ash because it speaks to a very different kind of fighting than what you'd expect from a mounted cavalry archer of the night. The skill temporarily fortifies a shield to deflect even attacks that would normally shatter through guard. It is a defensive technique, and the cavalry who carries it was almost certainly not its originator. They are mounted flail fighters who don't use shields in combat themselves. This reinforces the trophy theory. The barricade shield technique was taken from a shield warrior the cavalry defeated somewhere along a dark road, and now it rides in that knight's possession, waiting for the tarnished to take it in turn. Poison Moth Flight. The Knight's Cavalry in Caelid, patrolling the highway between the Caelid Highway South and southern Aeonia Swamp Bank sites of Grace, drops the Ash of War, Poison Moth Flight. Its skill description speaks of slashing with a poison-infused blade and dealing significant additional damage to a foe already poisoned. This is clearly a technique developed in or for the southern wastelands. Caelid, the Scarland created by Millennia's Bloom, where scarlet rot and ordinary poison intermingle in the swamp water, and the air itself feels wrong. Whatever warriors developed the poison moth flight technique lived in proximity to toxins, learned to use them, learned to layer them. The Knight's Cavalry claimed this skill from them. Whether those original wielders perished in the rot or were executed by Morgoth's riders for some act of defiance, the game never says. Phantom Slash in the Forbidden Lands. The Knight's Cavalry in the Forbidden Lands, just north of the site of Grace by that name, drops the Ash of War, Phantom Slash. And this particular cavalry encounter is notable beyond just its loot. The Forbidden Lands is the approach to the mountaintops of the Giants, a blasted corridor of ruins and smoke and nothing. The fact that the Knight's Cavalry patrols even this desolate threshold says something about the thoroughness of Morgoth's enforcement. The roads do not end where civilization ends. The patrol extends all the way to the edge of the known world. And the ash they carry there, Phantom Slash, which summons the ghost of their instructor, is fitting for the most isolated of all the cavalrymen, out here at the edge of everything, riding alone in a world of ash and shadow. Perhaps the memory of a teacher is all the company they have. The consecrated snowfield duo. The two Knights Cavalry encountered in the consecrated snowfield are unlike any of the others. They are not lone patrols. They ride together, escorting a great coffin carriage, a massive, slow-moving cart bearing the flowing, curved sword and whatever else it carries in its sealed darkness, through the blinding snowstorm of that half-hidden region. You have to find the consecrated snowfield by deciphering the Haligtree Medallion's two halves. The cavalry is already present when you arrive, moving northward through the snow. They are the hardest of all the knight's cavalry encounters, and they reward uniquely upon defeat. Among the drops is an ancient dragon-smithing stone, one of the rarest upgrade materials in the game, allowing a weapon to be fully upgraded to its maximum level. That they guard this particular item, escorting this particular carriage through this particular hidden region, implies the coffin they protect holds something the world was not supposed to find. What they actually are. The Teardrop scarab is one of the more unusual creature designs in a game filled with unusual creature designs. They are large beetles that roll balls of something, a compressed amalgam of what looks like packed earth or rock. Ahead of them, as they scuttle across the world, the ball is what contains the ash of war or other prize. The scarab itself is not hostile. It will not attack you. It will run. When it detects your approach, it skitters forward in a panic, and if you fail to catch and kill it before it completes its circuit or reaches a trigger point, it flickers and vanishes into thin air. Gone. The ash with it. This is essentially a real-time skill test, dressed in the aesthetic of a dung beetle. You must sprint, cut off its root, or hit it from range before it disappears. That tension, the scramble to kill something precious and fleeing, makes the rewards feel genuinely hunted for. The invisible ones. Some of the most valuable ashes in the game are carried by scarabs that simply cannot be seen. They are invisible to the naked eye. The only indicators of their presence are the trails they leave, subtle impressions in sand, ripples in shallow water, prints in snow or mud, faint skittering sounds against stone. The game trusts you to notice these details, to pause, to look at the ground rather than the horizon. The invisible Seppuku scarab on the frozen lake in the mountaintops of the Giants is perhaps the most famous example. Others include the Hoarfrost Stomp scarab in a pool southeast of Caria Manor, the Stamp, Sweep, scarab on the western beach of Limgrave, and the flame of the Redmane scarab near Fort Gale in Caelid. In each case, the game withholds a visual cue and instead asks you to read the environment, to track rather than simply spot. The Hoarfrost Stomp scarab. There is a shallow body of water southeast of Caria Manor in Liurnia of the Lakes, and in that water, completely invisible, a scarab patrols in a slow loop. It carries the ash of war, Hoarfrost Stomp. The only way to know it is there, before you've looked up a guide, before you've learned to scan every pool and stretch of disturbed earth, is to see the slight movement of water displaced by a creature that should not be displacing it, or to hear a sound that doesn't belong to the quiet wind off the lake. Players who find this on their first playthrough without guidance almost always describe the moment of realization, the sudden awareness that something is moving through the water unseen, as one of the most atmospheric discoveries in the game. Appropriately, the ash itself creates a burst of cold that freezes the ground in a spreading arc from the user's foot. Fort Hate and the blood-crazed knight. Most ashes of war in the game are carried by scarabs or sold by merchants or dropped by patrol bosses. The ash of war, Bloody Slash, is carried by something different. A Godric knight stationed at Fort Hate in eastern Limgrave. Specifically, the blood-crazed Godric knight, a named variant that patrols the fort's outer walls with an unsettling intensity. The fact that this particular knight has Bloody Slash, a blood oath technique tied to Morg's cult, while serving under the banner of Godric the Grafted, suggests something has gone badly wrong in Fort Hate's chain of command. Godric's followers were not supposed to be dabbling in Mog's blood covenant. That this knight carries the skill anyway speaks to how far the rot of Mog's influence had spread even into the lesser nobility's military apparatus, quietly, before the main events of the game. The sealing scarab in Leonia. In the Academy Gate town area of Leonia, there is a bridge guarded by poison pod enemies, those squat, seed-lobbing creatures that you learn to fear around the time you're approaching Raya Lucaria. Beneath that bridge, clinging to the ceiling above the path, a scarab hangs. It carries the Ash of War, Charge Forth, which grants the quality affinity and a lunging forward thrust. The scarab on a ceiling is a genuine oddity in the game. Most scarabs operate on ground level, rolling their balls across flat or gently sloping surfaces. This one requires you to be looking up while navigating a bridge guarded by lobbing enemies, which means most players miss it entirely, unless they've been told to look. It rewards a habit of looking at the spaces above and around rather than ahead and forward. The habit the whole game is quietly trying to build. The Celia Rooftop Scarab. The town of Celia in Caelid is a maze of rooftops and narrow elevated walkways, a ghost town overrun with invisible sorcerers and broken arcane experiments. To reach the scarab carrying the Ash of War, double slash, you have to climb up onto the rooftops themselves from specific entry points. The lower streets are blocked, and the ash simply cannot be reached from the ground. Double slash grants the ability to perform a crossing slash, with follow-up inputs for additional strikes, and it's a useful technique on swords and slashing polearms. But the method of acquisition makes it feel like a secret the town's former inhabitants deliberately left at altitude, accessible only to those willing to climb through their ruined home. Scarabs don't come back. One of the hardest facts about Ash of War scarabs is that they are finite, non-respawning creatures. When you kill one, it is dead. If you rest at a site of grace after killing it, it does not return. This is in contrast to Teardrop scarabs, the red and blue ones that restore your flask charges, which do respawn when you rest. The ash-carrying scarabs are a one-time offer. If you miss one, if it vanishes before you catch it, it does come back as long as you haven't killed it. Resting at a grace resets the world, and the scarab reappears to run again. But the moment it dies, it stays dead forever. That permanence, that one and done quality, turns each successful kill into a small ceremony. You got it, it's yours. You won't be getting a second chance. Enlarging scarabs. The standard scarab, roll up, chase it down, kill it, claim the ash, is the most common version you'll encounter. But there are variants. One of the more startling variants is the enlarging scarab, which, after taking a certain amount of damage, grows dramatically in size. Suddenly, the creature you are pursuing casually becomes a significantly larger threat, with a much larger hitbox and the potential to disrupt your attack cadence. The behavior is well telegraphed. The enlargement does not happen instantly, but encountering it for the first time has a way of making players feel momentarily betrayed by the game's rules. There are also teleporting scarabs, which blink a short distance away when spotted, and explosive scarabs, whose balls detonate after a few seconds. The explosive ones require a different strategy entirely. Kill the scarab before the ball goes off, or accept that you'll be catching the blast. The Stamp Sweep Scarab. On the western beach of Limgrave, northwest of the church of Elle, a scarab leaves glowing footprints across the sand near a series of ancient stone pillars. The scarab is invisible. The footprints are not. They glow faintly, circular impressions in the sand that orbit the pillars in a slow, patient loop. Attacking at the right moment, timing the approach so you catch the scarab as it comes around toward you, reveals it and allows you to kill it for the Ash of War. Stamp, sweep. This beach, with its crumbling pillars and the sound of the sea and the ghost trail of an invisible creature circling in the early game light, is one of the game's quieter corners. Most players sprint through it once, on horseback, heading somewhere else. The ones who slow down and look at the ground find something that was waiting for them all along. Skyshot's cliff, perch. In Dragonbarrow, the elevated northern section of Caelid that players access via Ascending Gate near the Third Church of Marika, there is a scarab perched on the edge of a cliff, near the isolated merchant's shack. The drop below it is lethal. The scarab carries the Ash of War. Skyshot, a ranged technique for bows and great bows that fires arrows in a high arc, raining down from above rather than projecting in a flat line. The location of this scarab, at the cliff edge, perched as if the thing had climbed up there specifically to be difficult to reach without walking to the edge of a fatal drop, feels like a deliberate piece of game design philosophy. The ash it carries is itself an elevated technique, one that requires thinking about vertical space and trajectory rather than direct fire. The scarab is, in its way, teaching the lesson of its own reward. Loretta's Slash, the Ash of War. Loretta's Slash does not come from a scarab. It drops from Royal Knight Loretta herself, the boss guardian of Carrier Manor in Liurnia. Loretta is a mounted knight of extraordinary grace and power. She wields a great bow and a curved blade halberd, and fights with the fluid economy of someone who has spent centuries perfecting both. When she dies, she drops the memory of her signature technique, a forward leap that imbues the blade with glintstone before descending into a sweeping slash, accelerating through the cut. The description attributes the skill to Loretta personally. This is not a tradition or an orders technique. It is hers. Taking it from her feels different from pulling an ash off a scarab. You fought the person. You survived what she knew, and now what she knew is yours. Beast's Roar, the Ash of War. Beast's Roar is earned from Gurink, Beast Clergyman, at the Bestial Sanctum in northern Dragonbarrow. Gurink is one of the more unusual NPCs in the game. An enormous stone-clad beast who's revealed over the course of Elden Ring to be a fragmented aspect of Malekith, the Black Blade. He asks you to bring him Deathroot, the corrupted remnants of the dead who refuse to return to the Erd Tree. After delivering 3 pieces, he rewards you with Beast's Roar, an ash that unleashes a roar that compresses air into a forward projectile blast. The technique is specifically available on any melee armament, which is unusual. Most ashes are weapon type specific. The breadth of its compatibility reflects the fact that Gurank's power is primal and fundamental, not tied to any particular tradition of swordsmanship or spearwork, but to something older and more animal. The key to everything. The Whetstone Knife is what unlocks the ability to use Ashes of War at Sites of Grace. Without it, you can still ask Hewg at the Round Table to apply them, but you cannot do it yourself. The knife is described as having a cipher inscription, a small, blade-shaped whetstone inscribed with knowledge, the mechanical medium through which the memories held in ashes can be pressed into actual metal. Carrying this knife is, in lore terms, presumably the same kind of technique transfer that Hewg performs manually. You have learned the grammar of the process. You can now speak directly to your weapons and the ashes they hold. The knife itself is found in a chest underground in Gatefront ruins, paired with Storm Stomp, a defensive stomp technique that generates a shockwave. The game offers it freely and immediately with minimal fanfare, as if daring you to understand what it's giving you. The Iron Whet Blade, hidden behind a fog gate in Stormvale Castle, sealed with an imp statue that demands a stone sword key, is the Iron Whetblade. It lies on a corpse in front of a stone furnace, in a room that also contains the Misericord, a dagger with the highest critical attack multiplier in the game. The Iron Whetblade expands the affinity options available for physical type Ashes of War to include Heavy, Keen, and Quality. Heavy affinity pushes a weapon scaling towards strength, Keen toward dexterity, and Quality provides a balanced enhancement to both. These are the foundational scaling paths of traditional melee combat in From Software games, and locking them behind a stone sword key in one of the game's first legacy dungeons is a subtle message. The most fundamental tools require a little effort to reach. The Glintstone Whetblade, in the debate parlour of Raya Lucaria Academy, just past the room where the Red Wolf of Radagon tried to stop you. A balcony overlooks a courtyard full of hostile sorcerers who lob spells from elevated positions. If you climb the rubble heap outside and find the doorway past a noble sorcerer on the balcony, you'll find a corpse slumped against the railing with the Glintstone Whetblade. It unlocks magic and cold affinities. The magic affinity converts a weapon's damage to magical energy and scales it with intelligence. The cold affinity is particularly prized. It simultaneously builds up frostbite status on enemies and scales with intelligence, creating a build path where melee fighters can inflict the devastating slow and multiply effect of frostbite through their normal attack chains. That this Whetblade is found in the Academy among scholars and researchers reflects the elegance and theory-driven nature of the affinities it unlocks. The Red-Hot Whetblade. Redmane Castle in southern Caelid is the seat of Starscourge Raiden's festival, the war camp built around the effort to contain or celebrate the gravity-mad demigod held back by his own magic at the edge of the continent. The Red-Hot Whetblade is found within, in a tower you reach by running past flamethrower enemies after entering from the chamber outside the plaza site of Grace. It unlocks fire and flame art affinities. Fire affinity converts damage to fire and scales primarily with strength. Flame art affinity adds less raw fire damage but scales more heavily with faith, making it the weapon path for warriors who channel devotion through flame. Appropriately, Radan and his Redmane soldiers are deeply associated with fire, both literally in their armor and aesthetic, and thematically in the burning defiance of a demigod who would rather drag down the stars than yield. The Black Whetblade. The Black Whetblade sits on a corpse in Nokron, Eternal City, the underground city that becomes accessible only after you defeat Starscourge Radan and allow the meteorite he was holding back to fall, opening a crater into the subterranean realm. From the ancestral woods site of Grace, you leap down toward the southwest, navigate past Silver Tears, head east through a broken arch and into a hall, and there it is. It unlocks poison, blood, and occult affinities. Blood affinity adds bleed build-up to a weapon and scales with arcane. Poison builds up the poison status effect. Occult, most unusually, causes all status effects and damage to scale with arcane, while simultaneously reducing native status build-up on the weapon, making it, counterintuitively, the better choice for arcane builds with weapons that have innate bleed. The Black Whetblade is deliberately placed deep underground behind a boss gate, accessible only to those who have conquered a demigod. Its affinities are not for beginners. The Sanctified Whetblade. The Sanctified Whetblade is found in the fortified manor within Leyndell Royal Capital, the exact copy, or original, of the Round Table Hold that exists within the city proper. To reach it, You enter through a balcony on the left side of the upper fortified manor, navigate past the rotten stray enemies near the Erdtree root, and find it on the floor of the inner room. Specifically, it sits in the spot where smithing master Hewg is located in the Roundtable Hold's version of the same building. That placement is deliberate and resonant. The most sacred wet blade, the one that unlocks lightning and sacred affinities, rests in the exact place where a cursed craftsman spends eternity forging weapons for strangers. The sanctified wet blade unlocks lightning affinity, which scales with dexterity and adds lightning damage, and sacred, which adds holy damage and scales with faith. Wet blades are permanent. Every wet blade you find persists through New Game Plus and every subsequent cycle. They cannot be farmed, cannot be found a second time in subsequent runs. They are unique items, but once acquired, they travel with you eternally. This is a quiet acknowledgement of mastery. Once you have learned how to infuse a weapon with a particular kind of power, that knowledge is yours permanently. There is something faintly lore resonant about this too. The wet blade, with its cipher inscription, implies that the knowledge it encodes is being absorbed by its holder rather than merely used. You are not renting access to these affinities. You are learning them. The sanctified wet blade and Hewg's place. The resonance of the sanctified wet blade sitting in Hewg's spot in Lendl's fortified manor goes deeper when you consider what the fortified manor represents. The Roundtable Hold exists outside of time and space. It is an impossible gathering point sustained by some aspect of Marika's power. The fortified manor is its physical counterpart inside the capital, the version that exists in real space. The sanctified wet blade in Hewg's spot implies that before the Roundtable Hold existed in its current metaphysical form, there was a real craftsman in a real manor who sat in that place and did this work with real hands. The sanctified wet blade, which unlocks divine affinities, being found in the place where that craftsman sat, gives the item a weight that goes beyond its utility. The black wet blade locked behind Radon, the gate keeping the black wet blade inaccessible until after Radan's defeat, is one of the most consequential progression locks in the game for builds that rely on status effects. Blood, poison, and occult affinities, the entire toolkit of the arcane and status-focused warrior, all require that you defeat a shard-bearing demigod before they become available. Radan is explicitly holding back the stars, but his death also, somewhat tangentially, opens the ground above Nokron and allows access to the underground city, where the black wet blade waits. A player who wants to build a dedicated bleed or poison character must first prove themselves capable of standing in front of a demigod astronaut on a tiny horse and surviving. The reward is access to the most mechanically unusual and high-skill expression affinity system in the game: bows, staves, and the standard wall. One of the more obscure limitations of the entire Ash of War system is that bows, including light bows and great bows, as well as staves and torches, can only ever be infused with the standard affinity. It does not matter what wet blades you carry. It does not matter what ash you apply. These weapon types are locked to standard. This means that ranged characters who rely on bows cannot shift their damage profile through affinities the way melee characters can. A bowman cannot make their bow scale with intelligence or faith. They can apply ashes that change the bow's skill, the way they fire, special techniques. But the fundamental damage scaling remains tied to the weapon's default values. This limitation is rarely discussed outside dedicated build communities, but it shapes the entire landscape of viable ranged archetypes in the game. Without all 5, entire builds don't exist. The cumulative gatekeeping effect of the 5 wet blades is that until you have all of them, entire categories of character build are mechanically unavailable. You cannot run a proper bleed arcane build until you have the black wet blade from Nokron, which requires killing Radon. You cannot run a dedicated Faith Lightning build until you have the sanctified wet blade from Leyndell, which requires substantial story progression. You cannot optimize a cold intelligence build until you have the glintstone wet blade from Raya Lucaria. The game's build variety, which looks open and flexible from the outside, is actually sequenced through these 5 items in a way that provides a natural difficulty and story arc for each playstyle. You encounter each new affinity when the story has led you to the culture that uses it. Bloodhound Steppe, the Ash of War. Bloodhound Steppe is found by killing the Knight's Cavalry at the bridge in front of Lenny's Rise Tower in Dragonbarrow. When activated, it costs 5 FP and the same stamina as a normal dodge roll. And in exchange, it makes you completely invisible for the duration of the movement animation, while providing a significantly faster dash than your standard roll, carrying with it a dramatically increased number of invincibility frames. The name comes from the Bloodhound Knight enemies scattered across the lands between, creatures that move with terrifying agility and a flickering, half-present quality, as though they exist only partially in the material world. Taking this ash means borrowing whatever technique those creatures use to slip between moments. For a period after launch, Bloodhound Steppe was considered borderline broken in player versus player encounters precisely because of how much evasive power it granted for such a low cost. It received adjustments, but remains one of the most consistently useful movement ashes in the game. Lion's Claw, the Ash of War. Lion's Claw is dropped by the Lion Guardian at Fort Gale in Caelid. Not a scarab, not a cavalry patrol, but a specific field boss that prowls the battlements of a crumbling fort. The Lion Guardian is an enormous, maned beast of a creature, moving with a combination of animal speed and something unnervingly structured, like a predator that has been trained and gone feral. When it dies, it leaves behind its signature technique, a forward somersault into a heavy slam, the momentum of the body channeled into a crashing downward cut. Lion's Claw is one of the most powerful ashes in the game for strength builds, particularly because of how dramatically it increases stance damage, the amount of damage dealt to an enemy's balance. On colossal weapons, it can break an enemy's stance in a single hit, setting up a critical strike. That it comes from a lion creature makes the technique feel appropriately animal. Impact over elegance. Flame of the Redmanes, the Ash of War. Flame of the Redmanes is carried by an invisible teardrop scarab near the Fort Gale north site of Grace in Caelid, the same general area where you find Lion's Claw. The scarab is invisible, leaving only the faint sound of its movement against the scorched earth. Flame of the Redmanes, when used, creates a sweeping arc of fire from a swing of the weapon, and it is compatible with any melee armament whatsoever, making it one of the most broadly usable ashes in the game. Its description names it as the fighting technique of Radon's Redmane soldiers, the cavalry that serves the gravity-obsessed demigod in Caelid. The Redmanes are distinguished by their loyalty in the face of Radon's deterioration. When he lost his mind to the Scarlet Rot, they did not abandon him, but instead organized a festival in his honor, drawing warriors from across the world to fight and be consumed by their deteriorating lord as a kind of mercy. Hoarfrost Stomp. At launch, the Ash of War. Hoarfrost Stomp was, by common consensus among the community, the single most powerful ash in the game. For only 10 FP, you stomped the ground and released an arc of frost that shot forward at remarkable range, growing wider as it travelled, and nearly guaranteed to proc frostbite on anything vulnerable to it in a single hit. The community found it almost immediately, and the speedrunning and challenge communities found it shortly after. From Software acknowledged the issue and issued a dedicated patch targeting specifically Hoarfrost's Stomp's effectiveness, one of the relatively few times in the game's history that a single item received a name nerf in the patch notes. Even after the nerf, it remains a genuinely useful ash for clearing groups and building up frostbite. Its fall from absolute dominance to merely excellent is, in its way, a story about how fragile supremacy is, even frozen in memory. Black Flame Tornado. There is an Ash of War that can only be obtained by defeating one of the most challenging optional boss encounters in the entire game. The Godskin duo in crumbling Faramazula, the ancient stone city suspended in a permanent hurricane above the lands of the Crucible. The Godskin duo is exactly what the name implies. Two Godskin enemies, a Godskin noble and a Godskin apostle, fighting simultaneously in the same arena. Both have significant health pools. When one dies, it eventually revives. Defeating them requires patience, adaptability, and either excellent dodging or enough raw power to kill both before the revive becomes a problem. The reward, dropped by the Godskin Noble variant in that encounter, is the Ash of War, Black Flame Tornado, which creates a vortex of black flame that deals percentage-based damage to enemies' maximum health. It is specifically designed for gods and demigods who are too healthy for ordinary damage to phase, and the game gives it to you in the approach to the endgame. Eruption. The most expensive Ash of War available for purchase from a merchant is the Ash of War, Eruption, sold by Knight Bernal in Volcano Manor for 8,000 runes. Bernal is one of the game's most complex and NPC characters, a Tarnished who operates as a hunter of other Tarnished, a member of the Assassin's Manor who will invade you as an enemy later if you progress far enough down his quest line. He sells Eruption from his post at the manor, a technique that causes you to slam your weapon into the ground and create an eruption of lava. The technique is usable only on large and colossal swords, axes, and hammers, weapons with the mass to transmit enough force through the earth to trigger volcanic activity. It is thematically perfect for Volcano Manor, and the fact that the game's most expensive purchasable ash is sold by a morally complicated NPC in a den of murderers says something about how power works in the lands between. Loretta's slash and glintstone swordsmanship. The description of Loretta's slash says the skill belongs to Loretta the Royal Knight specifically, and the mechanics of the technique involve the blade being imbued with glintstone, the blue glowing magical mineral that sorcery in the lands between is built around, mid-leap before the final sweeping strike. This fusion of physical swordsmanship and magical enhancement is the defining characteristic of the Carian tradition of combat. The Carian knights did not choose between sword and sorcery. They wove the two together at the level of technique, at the level of the individual strike. Loretta's slash is the embodiment of that philosophy expressed in a single move. The leap, the imbuing, the descent, the sweep. Royal Knight Loretta was the guardian of Carian Manor, the seat of the Carian royal family, and she carried this technique in service to that house until the moment she died at your hands. Determination versus Royal Knight's resolve. There are two Ashes of War in the game that perform a similar function. They are both pre-combat charging techniques that increase the power of your next attack, but the details distinguish them meaningfully. the Ash of War. Determination has you hold the flat of your blade to your face in a moment of focus, powering up the next blow. It drops from a scarab on the road southeast of the Agheel Lake north site of Grace in Limgrave, early in the game. The Ash of War, Royal Knight's Resolve, found deep in Volcano Manor, performs the same charging gesture, but powers up the next attack significantly more dramatically. The difference in power is notable. The difference in location is also telling. Determination is an early game Ash, accessible quickly, useful, but not overwhelming. Royal Knight's Resolve is locked behind one of the game's later legacy dungeons. Both preserve the same gesture, the same flat of blade vow, but the version that belongs to the knights who served the Elden Lord himself hits harder. Lifesteal Fist. There is a Teardrop scarab on the main Caelid path, near the smouldering wall in the central part of the region, that drops the Ash of War. Lifesteal Fist. The skill allows you to grab an enemy, leech life from them, and restore your own health in the process. It is one of the more unusual ashes in the game in that it directly restores HP, rather than dealing status effects or raw damage. The technique has a specific in-world context. The Caelid region is defined by desperation and rot, and the frantic measures that organisms and warriors take to survive in a landscape that is trying to kill everything. A technique that steals life force from enemies in order to sustain your own is very much in the spirit of that environment. Take what you need from whatever remains alive long enough to have something worth taking. Stormcaller, the Ash of War. Stormcaller generates a localized storm around the user when activated, summoning swirling wind energy that strikes enemies caught in the vortex. Its description calls it one of the skills that channel the tempests of Stormvale. And fittingly, it is found inside Stormvale Castle itself, dropped by a scarab in the northern section of the castle, near the secluded cell site of Grace. It is available on swords, axes, hammers and polearms, making it broadly accessible within those categories. Stormcaller is one of several ashes in the game that evokes the storm iconography associated with Godric's lineage. Godric himself inherits some of the ancient dragon storm power through his grafted forms, and the castle he rules is defined by that aesthetic. A warrior who internalized the storm technique in that environment would fight as though carrying a piece of the sky on their blade. Cragblade, the Ash of War. Cragblade is one of the more mechanically niche ashes in the game, valued by a specific community of players for a specific reason. It dramatically increases stance damage. Stance damage, or poise damage, is the accumulated impact that drives an enemy into a staggered, break-prone state, creating the opportunity for a critical strike. Most ashes deal ordinary damage. Cragblade temporarily enhances the weapon's ability to break enemy stance specifically, and the technique itself involves striking the ground with concussive force that imbues the weapon with a stony, heavy energy. For players building around repeatedly staggering large enemies or bosses, Cragblade is among the most targeted tools available. The ash is found on a scarab, and its utility is narrow enough that it tends to be overlooked by players building for raw damage output, which means it tends to be consistently underestimated. Ground Slam, the Ash of War. Ground Slam is notable for a mechanical quirk that the Elden Ring fandom wiki documents with appropriate care. It is one of the very few ashes whose skill damage scales specifically and exclusively with the heavy affinity. Applying any other affinity, even one that increases the weapon's overall attack rating, will actually decrease Ground Slam's output compared to running heavy. This is because Ground Slam's damage calculation is directly tied to the strength scaling output of the weapon. and the heavy affinity maximizes that strength scaling in a way no other affinity matches. For strength build players who favor Ground Slam's upward launch effect, this is good news. For anyone who tries to optimize it with a more complex affinity setup, it is a lesson in how the Ash of War system occasionally has internal rules that run counter to the player's intuitive assumptions. Vow of the Indomitable. There is a Teardrop scarab in the swampy southwest area of Liurnia, near the Cathedral of Manus Sellus, that carries the Ash of War. Vow of the Indomitable. The skill provides a brief window of complete invincibility, not damage reduction, not increased poise, but actual immunity to all incoming damage for a short duration, in exchange for rooting you in place and costing FP. The description ties it to the sacred affinity. The name is the detail worth sitting with. The Vow of the Indomitable is not a technique of evasion or speed or power. It is a technique of absolute refusal. You stand your ground, commit entirely to the vow, and for that fraction of a second, you are untouchable. Then the moment passes. Then you are a person again, with a weapon in your hand and an enemy in front of you. And you either use that invincibility window to set up something decisive, or you didn't. Spinning Strikes and the Revenger's Sorrow. The Ash of War. Spinning Strikes is one of the more emotionally charged ashes in the game to acquire because of who you take it from and what brought him to that moment. Edgar is the Castellan of Castle Morn, the father of Irina, the blind woman you find weeping on the road into the Weeping Peninsula. If you complete Irina's questline and return to the castle, you find Edgar has gone hollow with grief after his daughter's death, driven beyond reason into a state of obsessive vengeance against the world. He invades you at the Revenger's Shack in Liurnia, a broken man on a broken errand. When he dies, he drops a banished knight's halberd with spinning strikes already attached, a polearm skill that spins the weapon continuously overhead, deflecting projectiles while dealing area of effect damage. The technique is almost cheerful in its circular energy. The man who carries it is anything but. Blood Tax. There are 2 Ashes of War in the game that bear the specific designation of Blood Oath skill granted by the Lord of Blood. The first is Bloody Slash, found early in Limgrave at Fort Hate, the first and most accessible gift of Mohg's cult. The second is Blood Tax, and it is found in a cave hidden along the eastern stone wall of Mogwyn Palace. North of the palace approach Ledge Road site of Grace, guarded by 4 blood-tainted albinorics who materialize around the scarab when you try to kill it. The cave is easy to walk past entirely. Blood Tax is a flurry of thrusting attacks, a spinning wind-up followed by rapid piercing strikes that steal both blood and health from whatever they connect with. The description matches Bloody Slash beat for beat in its framing. Both are gifts of the Lord of Blood. Both involve an exchange of your health for power. Blood Tax trades your blood not as fuel, but as a tithe, a continuing payment to a god who is never finished collecting. Through and Through. The Ash of War. Through and Through is one of the more obscure ashes in the game, found near Volcano Manor, on an invisible teardrop scarab in the Altus Plateau, that is difficult to spot without knowing to look. The skill fires a projectile that pierces through enemies and continues traveling, capable of striking multiple targets in a line. Most combat in Elden Ring is fundamentally close range. Weapon and shield, dodge and punish. And Through represents a specific tradition of combat thinking. The idea that a single committed thrust, given enough precision and power, need not stop at the first obstruction. It passes through. It keeps going. For players who enjoy punishing tight enemy formations, or who want a ranged option on a melee weapon, this ash rewards patience and positioning in a way that few others do. Shield Bash. There is a Teardrop scarab near the East Bridge Trestle site of Grace in Liurnia, directly below the ruined bridge connecting the Academy of Raya Lucaria with the Bellum Highway that carries the Ash of War. Shield Bash. It is a teleporting scarab, meaning it blinks short distances away when you approach, demanding either a ranged attack or careful positioning to kill before it escapes. Shield Bash converts the act of holding a shield from a purely defensive posture into an offensive weapon. You ram the shield into an enemy with enough force to stagger them, creating an opening for a follow-up strike. It is, mechanically, the philosophy that a shield in the right hands is never just a wall. It is a battering ram. The scarab's position under a crumbling bridge that was once a road of scholars and travellers adds a faint irony. This particular technique of aggressive defence was waiting beneath a ruined crossing, as if whoever left it there knew that sometimes the only way forward is straight through whatever is in the way. Shield Crush. The Ash of War. Shield Crush is found on a Teardrop scarab in the Lux Ruins in Western Altus Plateau. Lux Ruins are a scattered collection of broken structures near the bridge crossing into Altus, unremarkable enough that many players pass through them quickly on the way to whatever they're actually going to. Shield Crush is a technique for medium and large shields that slams the shield downward with both hands, driving it into the ground or into an enemy with crushing force, then following with a heaving upward blow. It is among the most dramatically damage-focused of the shield-based ashes, turning what is usually the game's most passive defensive equipment into something that hits as heavily as a greatsword. The fact that it is found in an unremarkable ruin off a well-travelled road makes it one of the more consistently overlooked ashes in the game, which is, in a way, the nature of practical power. It doesn't announce itself. Spinning Gravity Thrust. One of the DLC's most evocative ashes is Spinning Gravity Thrust, which lets you hurl the weapon spinning at the ground to create a gravity well, an upward vortex that draws enemies into the air before pulling them down. The gravity manipulation here is unmistakably reminiscent of Radan's powers, the gravity magic of the demigod who suspended the stars rather than allow them to fall on his people. But Spinning Gravity Thrust is not Radan's move specifically. It is a technique drawn from a lineage of gravity-wielding combat that preceded him. And in the DLC's Land of Shadow, it finds itself in proximity to forces older than any of the demigods. The technique itself requires weapons capable of thrusting, and the spinning launch before the gravity eruption has a quality of ritual to it, like a prayer sent downward rather than up. Golden Parry. The Ash of War. Golden Parry is found on a teleporting Teardrop scarab on one of the northern balconies of the Grand Staircase leading up to the western gate of Leyndell, royal capital. The scarab is perched on a railing above, and you cannot reach it on foot from below. The only reliable method is to shoot it with a ranged weapon before it vanishes. The ash itself transforms a parry from a purely mechanical deflection into something that carries the weight of the Erdtree. You channel an Erdtree incantation through the shield swing, creating a wide arc of golden light that deflects incoming attacks and staggers enemies even at a slight distance. Normal parries demand perfect proximity. Golden Parry gives you a few extra feet of forgiveness, that golden arc reaching out just a bit further than a human arm can. There is something quietly profound about a defensive technique grounded in faith. The shield does not hold the blow back on its own merit. The gold does. Assassin's Gambit. The the Ash of War. Assassin's Gambit is sold by Knight Bernal at Volcano Manor for 6,500 runes after you complete the manor's first assassination contract. Its description is economical and precise. Skill that masks the user's presence at the cost of a self-inflicted wound, grants near invisibility and silences footsteps. The self-inflicted wound is not metaphorical. Activating the skill involves a slicing motion against your own hand, and the technique costs 35 HP in addition to 5 FP. What it buys you is 30 seconds of near invisibility. Enemies' lock-on range reduces dramatically. Footsteps produce no sound, and at distance you become genuinely difficult to perceive. The community eventually discovered that the technique also stacks with the unseen form sorcery, and with items like the Blindfold of Happiness, reducing aggro range to the point where players reported walking directly into most major boss arenas without triggering any reaction. The name earns itself in full. The Gambit is the wound you give yourself in exchange for the power to disappear. Raptor of the Mist, the Ash of War. Raptor of the Mist is not found on a scarab or sold by a merchant. It is earned by helping the bloody finger hunter Yura defeat his target near the main academy gate site of Grace in Leonia. Yura is one of Elden Ring's more understated NPCs, a hunter of bloody fingers, the PvP invading killers who follow Mog's blood covenant, who pursues his work across the lands between with quiet conviction. When you answer his summon sign and help him kill the Ravenmount assassin on the Broken Bridge, he rewards you with this ash. Its description says, duck into a low stance, momentarily vanishing. If an enemy attack connects, avian wings will allow for a quick escape into the air. It is the only ash in the game that rewards being hit, rather than punishing getting hit. You crouch, you briefly disappear, you absorb the strike, and then phantom wings carry you upward into a launching counterattack. It is the technique of something built to survive the blow and use it. Thops' Barrier. Thops is one of the more melancholy characters in all of Elden Ring. He is a failed sorcery student, too poor to pay the Academy's tuition, sitting in the Church of Irith near the Leonia Lake shore, dreaming of a life inside those blue towers he'll probably never see again. If you complete his quest line, you eventually find him dead in the Academy, having finally gotten back inside, seated at a desk as though studying, having simply run out of time before the knowledge could matter. The Ash of War, Thops' Barrier, which can be found on a scarab at the Church of Irith, is named after him. It creates a magical parrying shield that reflects incoming sorceries back at their casters. That a defensive technique against the very magic he spent his life seeking is named for Thops, is named for someone who died at the door of what he wanted. Feels like the game encoding grief directly into a weapon skill. Carrion Retaliation, the Ash of War. Carrion Retaliation is one of the most technically demanding and rewarding ashes in the entire game for players who fight in areas populated by sorcerers. When equipped on a shield and used at the moment an enemy spell would connect, it not only parries the sorcery but generates up to 3 magical glint blades that hang in the air for a moment before homing in and striking back at the target. You are not simply deflecting the attack. You are catching it, decomposing it into glintstone energy, and firing it back in triplicate. It is purchased from Pidia, Carrion Servant, an NPC found in a hidden room inside Carrier Manor, accessible only after you defeat Royal Knight Loretta and navigate down from the cliff above the manor's lower level. Pidia sits scrubbing the floor in a shadowed corner and sells this ash for 3,000 runes. The fact that it requires you to breach the heart of the Carrion Royal Seat to purchase it reflects exactly what the technique represents. The Carrion royal family's secret means of preparing against the disloyalty of the Academy, as the sorcery variant's description explicitly states. There is something genuinely elegant about a defensive technique that turns its user into a mirror. Mighty Shot, the Ash of War. Mighty Shot is found on a Teardrop scarab between Limgrave and the Weeping Peninsula, near the southern bridge. It charges a bow shot to deliver dramatically increased damage compared to a standard arrow. A technique that rewards patience and the willingness to hold the draw just a moment longer. Among dedicated archer builds, Mighty Shot is frequently cited as the single most consistently useful bow ash in the game, because its output scales cleanly and its damage is straightforward. It does not seek targets. It does not produce status effects. It simply hits harder. For players who appreciate the purity of a technique that does exactly one thing and does it exceptionally well, Mighty Shot is the gold standard. The reminder that sometimes the most powerful thing in any toolkit is the thing that cannot be argued with. Lightning Slash, the Ash of War. Lightning Slash is dropped by a Teardrop scarab just north of the capital outskirts. The technique charges the weapon with lightning before delivering a swinging horizontal cut that produces an explosive shock on impact. It is one of 3 base game lightning affinity ashes alongside Lightning Ram and Thunderbolt, and its position just outside the gates of Leyndell, the capital city of the Golden Order, whose power was maintained by the Erd Tree's light rather than the Dragon Cult's lightning, implies that whoever developed Lightning Slash either arrived at the capital from outside its orthodox traditions or was practicing something the Order considered marginal. Lightning in the lands between is associated with ancient dragons and with Farum Azula, rather than the Erd Tree's golden warmth, which makes a lightning technique found at the capital's doorstep quietly suggestive of older powers pressing against newer walls. Enchanted Shot, the Ash of War. Enchanted Shot is found inside Nokron, Eternal City, the underground realm unlocked after Radan's defeat. On a scarab hidden behind a rock near the shimmering, silver-tinged streets of the Eternal City. It is one of the few bow-compatible ashes in the game, and it enchants an arrow with magical energy before firing, creating a projectile that tracks toward the target and deals additional magic damage. As a bow technique, it exists in a fairly narrow mechanical space. Most bow user builds in Elden Ring favor either pure physical output or Mighty Shot's sheer power, but the tracking component of Enchanted Shot gives it a consistency at range that the others lack. Finding it in Nokron is quietly fitting. The Silver Tears, the ancestral spirit culture, the half-light of the Eternal City. It is the kind of place where you'd expect a technique that bends light and seeks its target to call home. Spectral Lance, the Ash of War. Spectral Lance is found on a Teardrop scarab inside the Academy of Raya Lucaria itself, a relatively rare instance of an ash that rewards thorough exploration of a legacy dungeon, rather than the overworld. Spectral Lance conjures a bolt of magical energy in the shape of a spear and hurls it forward, and while it is primarily associated with magic-type ashes, it works on a wider range of armaments than you might expect. Finding it inside the Academy, rather than in the surrounding countryside, links it to the scholarly tradition of Liurnia. Not a warrior's technique born from practical combat, but something developed in the context of research and controlled application of glintstone theory. In the Academy, even the weapons are experiments. Flaming Strike, the Ash of War. Flaming Strike is tucked away in a small graveyard along the south cliffside behind Redmane Castle in Caelid, accessible by hugging the cliff from the front gate past a ballista and a group of giant bats, then jumping a gap to reach the buried-away cemetery. It is easy to walk past entirely if you approach the castle through the main gate and never think to look behind it. The technique itself coats the weapon in fire after the initial arc, meaning the follow-up strike keeps burning for a full 20 seconds, giving you a ranged fire blast that transitions directly into a buffed weapon for the rest of the engagement. It is one of the relatively rare ashes that can be applied to already infused weapons, bypassing the usual restriction that prevents elemental buffs from stacking. For a strength or faith build that wants fire damage without fully committing to a fire-infused weapon, Flaming Strike offers a temporary conversion, a way of carrying the Red Mane's fire on a weapon that was never meant to burn. The Ash of War. Prayerful Strike is one of the more utilitarian ashes in the game, functioning primarily as a combat healing tool. When it successfully hits, it restores a significant portion of your maximum health, approximately 30%, to both you and any nearby allies in range. It requires hammers or axes to use, weapons associated with heavy, committed downward force, rather than the precision of a blade. The technique's description frames it as a prayer. You raise the weapon aloft before slamming it into the ground, and that sincere blow returns health rather than just dealing damage. Found on an invisible Teardrop scarab in the capital outskirts moat, near the western entrance to Lendl, it sits just outside the gates of the most sacred city in the lands between. For faith-based builds who want to sustain themselves through combat without spending a flash charge, Prayerful Strike offers a rhythm of strike and recover that becomes almost meditative once mastered. Sacred Ring of Light, a Teardrop. Scarab sits on the eastern edge of the Aeonian Swamp in Caelid, east of the heart of Aeonia's site of grace, in the thick of the Scarlet Rot and the ambient wrongness that defines that region. It carries the Ash of War, Sacred Ring of Light, a skill that fires a ring of golden radiance forward from the weapon, capable of being discharged in rapid succession. It is a holy type projectile on a melee weapon, which makes it unusual. Most ranged options on melee builds are either magical or physical. Sacred Ring of Light extends the battlefield for faith-aligned warriors who don't want to swap to a staff or seal, but still need to reach something at a distance. That it sits in the heart of Caelid's most poisoned zone, a golden ring of pure, holy energy hiding in a swamp of rot, is a contrast the game frames as discovery, rather than irony. Storm Assault. There is a Teardrop scarab inside Stormvale Castle itself that drops the Ash of War, Storm Assault, a charging technique that propels the user forward with wind energy wrapped around the weapon. Most Stormvale ashes are found in the castle's surrounding areas, the roads, the cliffs, the gatefront, but this one requires you to be inside the dungeon, navigating the lift that descends into the lower sections of the castle, catching the scarab on the path before it vanishes into the stone. Storm Assault's charging mechanism makes it useful for closing distance on enemies that kite or retreat, but its real appeal is aesthetic, in a castle defined by storm imagery, by the grey sky and the crack of thunder and the wind that makes the battlements feel unstable. A technique that wraps you in storm energy as you charge feels thematically inevitable. Double slash, the technique itself, a crossing slash with up to 2 follow-up attacks, is straightforward enough. What makes the Ash of War double slash memorable is the method of finding it. Celia, town of sorcery in Caelid, is a location that operates on 2 levels. The street level, cluttered with invisible sorcerers and failed experiments, and the rooftop level, accessible only through specific climbing routes and jumps from the town's elevated structures. The scarab carrying double slash is on a large route on the western side of the town, and that route is only reachable from above. Players who never learn to navigate Celia's vertical geography never find this ash. It is held at altitude deliberately, a reward for those who looked up rather than forward. What the DLC added. The Shadow of the Erdtree expansion released in June 2024, and it brought with it 25 new Ashes of War, pushing the total across the base game and DLC to 116. This is a substantial addition, not a handful of curiosities, but a full secondary system with techniques tied to entirely new weapon categories and cultural traditions. The Land of Shadow is not the Lands Between. It operates under different rules, worships different powers, and the warriors who lived and died there developed combat techniques that reflect that difference. The DLC Ashes are not simply reskins of base game techniques with different affinities. Many of them represent entirely new mechanical ideas. Throwing techniques, bestial charges, wing-based aerial assaults that the base game never gestured toward. Blind Spot, the Ash of War. Blind Spot comes pre-equipped on the backhand blade found beside a coffin in the Inquisitor enemy area of Gravesite Plain, one of the first significant areas you encounter upon entering the Land of Shadow. The backhand blade is itself a new weapon type introduced in the DLC, designed for rapid strikes that flow around an opponent's defenses, and Blind Spot is specifically designed for it. The skill leaps into close quarters to exploit the enemy's blind spot, attacking from the side and slipping below their guard, with your input determining which side you strike from. It is a technique of spatial awareness, of reading where an opponent cannot see and getting there first. Because it is unique to backhand blades, it represents something the base game's entire Ash system rarely does. A skill so specific to a weapon's character that it cannot be meaningfully separated from it. Savage Lion's Claw, the DLC's Ash of War. Savage Lion's Claw is found in Gravesite Plain, north of the three-path cross site of Grace, near a small camp of enemies. Its description names it as the skill of the particularly brave, even among the Redmanes. This is remarkable context. The Redmane soldiers, Radan's Cavalry, the Firebearers of Caelid, are already defined as warriors of extraordinary loyalty and courage, warriors who stayed beside a deteriorating demigod rather than flee. The Savage Lion's Claw is named after the bravest among those already exceptionally brave fighters. The technique itself is a forward somersault that strikes with the weapon on the way down, with an optional additional input for a follow-up. It is the base game's Lion's Claw evolved, a technique that adds momentum and a secondary commitment on top of the already aggressive dive of the original. Raging Beast, the Ash of War. Raging Beast is found on a teleporting Teardrop scarab in the Land of Shadow, in the area near the bridge leading to the village site of Grace. From that Grace, you follow the path north until you reach trees, then scan east for the scarab, which is of course teleporting, blinking away from your approach in short jumps. Raging Beast technique steps with the swiftness and leaping aggression of an animal, launching the character high into the air before crashing down on the foe with a weapon extended. The name is not subtle about what it is. This is not a trained fighter's precise movement. It is abandon. It is the attack of something that has given up on calculation and committed entirely to impact. In the Land of Shadow, where the rules and pretensions of the Lands Between's nobility do not apply, a technique this raw feels exactly right. Carrion Sovereignty, the Ash of War. Carrion Sovereignty is found on a scarab clinging to the ceiling of a cave southwest of the Cathedral of Manusmeta in the DLC, in a chamber filled with glint-slab fireflies that give the space a blue-white ambient glow. Its description says it is skill passed down the Carrion royal family, a distinction that separates it clearly from the Loretta Slash and Carrion Greatsword Ashes of the base game, which are skills of individual knights and of a general scholarly tradition. Sovereignty belongs to the bloodline itself. When activated, it transforms the blade into a massive magical greatsword that crashes down in a vertical slam, followed by a horizontal sweep. The scale of the resulting magical weapon dwarfs the physical one you're holding. It is the Carrion royal family's combat heritage distilled into a single statement. What they wielded was never merely what you could see. Aspects of the crucible, wings, one of the most visually dramatic ashes in the entire game, including the DLC, is aspects of the crucible. Wings, dropped by Black Knight Edred at the Fort of Reprimand in Scadu Altus. Its description says, this skill originates from the life forms of the crucible. The crucible is Elden Ring's name for the primal state of life, before the Erdtree's order imposed differentiation. The ancient soup of undifferentiated being from which all distinct creatures eventually arose. The crucible incantations and techniques evoke this primordial state, manifesting aspects of ancient creatures that no longer exist in pure form. Wings summons a golden pair of wings from your back before launching you airborne in a diving thrust. When used with twin blades, the attack transforms into a spinning charge. The Fort of Reprimand, a place of judgment and punishment, guards this reminder of life before judgment existed. The poison flower blooms. Twice. The Ash of War. The poison flower blooms twice is one of the more thematically interesting DLC ashes, translating a very specific idea about poison into combat mechanics. The technique involves applying poison to an enemy and then detonating it. Landing a specific follow-up attack on a poisoned foe deals dramatically increased damage, as though the accumulated toxin is triggered into a sudden lethal bloom. This is not just dealing poison damage over time. This is using the slow poison as the first stage of a two-stage process, with the second stage as the actual killing blow. The name describes the structure of the skill perfectly. The flower of the poison blooms once when it is applied, and again when it is detonated. It is, in miniature, the philosophy of patience, of understanding that the real damage comes not from the immediate strike, but from knowing when to strike twice. White Shadow's Lure, the Ash of War. White Shadow's Lure is one of the most consistently overlooked ashes in the entire game. A utility skill that creates a phantom decoy of the player, drawing enemy attention and potentially repositioning mobs for ambushes or escapes. Many players with hundreds of hours in Elden Ring report being completely unaware it exists, and community members frequently express surprise when it surfaces in discussion. Its very function is concealment and misdirection, which makes the fact that it conceals itself from most players' awareness feel like a kind of design poetry. The ash does exactly what it says, and it does it by not making you look at it. Barbaric Roar. The Ash of War. Barbaric Roar is found on a teardrop scarab in the ravine-veiled village in northern Leonia of the lakes, a narrow ravine at the far northeastern end of the lake, guarded by a trio of giant bats that materialize when you approach the scarab at the ravine's end. It grants the heavy affinity and the skill of a roar that both buffs attack power and alters your heavy attacks into savage combo strikes for the duration. When activated, your character unleashes a guttural shout, charging their body with brutal energy that makes the following strikes land harder. There is a specific pleasure in using barbaric raw on weapons that are already aggressive. Colossal axes, great axes, heavy hammers, and finding that the raw pushes them past even those already extreme thresholds. The technique is, at its core, a rejection of trained refinement in favor of animal instinct. The raw that changes how you fight, not just how hard you hit, is something unique in the roster. It doesn't just add a damage number, it changes your moveset entirely. Warcry, the Ash of War. Warcry is one of the most broadly accessible raw-type ashes in the game, sold by Knight Bernal at the Warmaster's shack in Limgrave early on. Like Barbaric Raw and Braggart's Raw, it belongs to a specific category of techniques, raw-type skills that don't just buff a single number, but modify the fundamental behavior of your weapon's heavy attacks for their duration. Warcry specifically shifts your heavy attacks into a faster, more aggressive charging combo, altering what was already powerful into something with additional forward momentum. The Raw itself has a shorter cast time than its counterparts, making it more viable in active combat rather than as a pre-fight ritual. That 3 distinct raw ashes exist in the game, each finding slightly different trade-offs between cast speed, buff duration, and bonus magnitude, suggests that whoever designed the system understood that the act of a warrior declaring themselves before a fight is not one thing. It is a whole tradition, with as many variations as there are warriors willing to make the noise. Braggart's Raw, the Ash of War. Braggart's Raw is found on the Iron Ball weapon, dropped by Blackguard Big Boggart, one of the game's most warmly written minor NPCs, a vendor of boiled crabs and prawns, who sits at the Boiled Prawn Shack in Leonia, all bluster and self-promotion. You can kill him there, or encounter his corpse later as part of the Dung Eater's questline, and strip the ash from the weapon he carried. Braggart's Raw raises attack power, defense, and stamina recovery simultaneously. A triple buff for the price of announcing your presence with a deeply undignified shout. The detail that it comes from Boggart specifically is one of the game's more quietly funny pairings. The description says you're declaring your presence with a boastful roar, which is more or less exactly how Boggart approaches every interaction. He was not subtle. He was not refined. He sold shellfish from a shack by a lake, and he bragged constantly. And the technique name for that energy is mechanically excellent. Earthshaker, the Ash of War. Earthshaker is found on an invisible teardrop scarab on the road south of the Altus Highway junction site of Grace, a flat stretch of the Altus Plateau near a statue at the first intersection, where the scarab moves slowly enough that you can hear it and see the small cloud of dust it kicks up as it circles. It drives the weapon into the earth and sends a shockwave outward, and it is one of the heavier, slower activating ashes in the game, requiring a weapon class capable of generating the impact force to split stone. The Altus Plateau is the elevated plateau overlooking the lower lands, a region that carries the sense of a higher power. The Erd-tree is visible from almost everywhere up here, and the road the scarab walks was clearly once a thoroughfare of importance. An ash that splits the earth underfoot feels less like a technique here, and more like something the land remembers from the giants and the wars that once shook even this elevation. Sacred Blade, the Ash of War. Sacred Blade charges the weapon with golden holy energy before releasing it in a projectile slash of radiant light. It is a versatile ash compatible with most melee armaments, and its sacred affinity makes it immediately useful against the undead and those who live in death. Enemies vulnerable to holy damage who populate graveyards, catacombs, and the night roads near Tibia Mariners. Found on a teardrop scarab north of the Third Church of Marika in Limgrave, next to a spirit spring, it represents a bridge technique, not purely a faith-build tool, since its projectile can be used on standard affinity without any faith investment, but deeply rewarding for characters who have built toward the divine. The slash of light that it fires moves forward like a prayer with a cutting edge, solemn, direct, and final. Spinning slash. Knight Bernal at the Warmaster's shack sells the Ash of War, spinning slash for a modest sum early in the game. Its description is spare and precise. Skill favored by dexterous warriors. It performs a spinning slash followed by an optional additional input for a second strike. And the keen affinity it naturally pairs with makes it a reliable early game choice for players building toward dexterity scaling. What is notable about spinning slash relative to the other ashes Bernal sells, impaling thrust, parry, quickstep, is how directly it rewards the player who has not yet discovered anything extraordinary but wants to fight with intention. It is a fundamentally competent technique, favored, not flashy. The kind of skill that defines a professional rather than a legend, and that carries a fighter through the middle portions of the game because it works reliably every time you call on it. Palm Blast, the DLC's Ash of War. Palm Blast is one of the most conceptually unusual additions to the roster because it is a technique that works on fist weapons. An entirely new weapon category introduced in Shadow of the Erdtree that includes claws, beast claws, and hand-to-hand implements. Palm Blast detonates a concussive burst of force from the palm, launching enemies backward. It is mechanically a close-range repulsion technique, and it reframes the idea of a strike completely. The hit is not the weapon connecting, but the energy expelled at point of contact. For players who have spent years thinking of attack as the blade arrives at the target, Palm Blast inverts the model. The blade does not arrive, the palm does, and the force comes after. Blink Bolt, the DLC's Ash of War. Blink Bolt is a lightning affinity technique that allows the user to transform into a bolt of lightning and dash through enemies in a brief, devastatingly fast lunge. It is one of the most mobile ashes in either the base game or the DLC. Faster and more directional than Bloodhound Step, trading the invisibility of that technique for a visual spectacle of electrical movement and the raw damage of a lightning-type strike. For players who fight at the edge of being overwhelmed, always just managing the space between too close and too far, Blink Bolt collapses that calculation entirely. You are not dodging the enemy, you are moving through them. The name is literal in the most elegant way possible. You blink, and then you are a bolt, and then you are somewhere else. Flame Skewer. One of the DLC's Flame Art Affinity ashes, Flame Skewer, is associated with the Fire Knights of the Land of Shadow, an order of armored warriors who serve a different tradition of fire than the one practiced in the lands between Volcano Manor or the Dragon Cult. Their fire is not volcanic. It is not ancient draconic. It is fire that belongs to their order specifically, a particular tradition of controlled application and devotional heat. Flame Skewer converts that tradition into a driving forward thrust that leaves a pillar of flame in its wake. Finding it in the DLC means engaging with the Fire Knights as more than just enemies. They are the custodians of a technique that came from somewhere and was developed over a long time, and defeating them is the only way to claim what they guard. Wing Stance, the DLC's Ash of War. Winged Stance introduces a new combat philosophy to the Ashes system, the ability to enter a hovering posture and select between multiple follow-up attacks from the air. It is one of the few Ashes that operates in 2 stages. The initial stance entry is the skill activation, and then the choice of attack is the second input. And it rewards players who can read the situation quickly enough to select the right option while already committed to the aerial position. Winged Stance expands the Elden Ring combat vocabulary in a direction that no base game Ash pointed toward. The idea that a skilled fighter does not just use the ground as their stage, but deliberately removes themselves from it to access a different category of angles and force. Dryleaf Whirlwind, the Ash of War. Dryleaf Whirlwind is obtained from Dryleaf Dane, a wandering martial arts practitioner encountered in the DLC. Dryleaf Dane is one of the more unusual NPCs in Shadow of the Erd Tree, a fighter who has stripped weaponry down to its barest essentials, fighting primarily with hand-to-hand techniques tied to the Dryleaf arts. When you defeat Dane, the technique passes to you. Dryleaf Whirlwind is a sweeping spinning kick and palm strike combination, a technique of unarmed combat made transferable to armed weapons as a kind of philosophical overlay. The weapon's path follows the movement the body would have made without it. It is a martial artist's signature move translated into the language of armed combat, and its presence in an expansion that introduced hand-to-hand weapons as a full new category speaks to how seriously the DLC took the idea of combat traditions beyond blade and shield. Divine Beast Frost. Stomp. The Ash of War. Divine Beast. Frost Stomp is one of the DLC's cold affinity ashes, tied to the tradition of the Divine Beast Dancing Lion, the enormous fox god creature that serves as one of Shadow of the Erd Tree's most visually spectacular encounters. The technique channels the Divine Beast's cold magic into a stomp that erupts frost outward from the point of impact, with a scale and energy that deliberately echoes the base game's Hoarfrost Stomp, but with a visual language drawn from the Land of Shadow's spiritual aesthetic, where Hoarfrost Stomp is blunt and geological, a crack in frozen earth. Divine Beast Frost Stomp carries the flowing energy of something sacred, something worshipped. The cold in the Land of Shadow is not merely an environmental hazard. It is an aspect of divine power, and this ash makes that power portable. Shriek of Sorrow. The Ash of War. Shriek of Sorrow carries the occult affinity, and its description evokes the keening cry of something in unimaginable pain, a wail that resonates with the arcane forces of the world, rather than any physical or elemental damage type. The occult school in Elden Ring is connected to the hidden and secret aspects of the world, powers that the Golden Order preferred not to acknowledge, abilities that operate through channels the mainstream theological framework cannot explain. Shriek of Sorrow belongs to this tradition. It does not cut or burn or freeze. It reaches into some deeper register of suffering and releases it outward. For arcane builds seeking an ash that reflects the character of their chosen stat, mysterious, unsettling, connected to blood and ancient knowledge, Shriek of Sorrow is among the most thematically coherent choices in the entire DLC. The Tarnished's Body as Weapon. Several Ashes of War in Elden Ring require the player to damage themselves as part of their activation, and taken together, these form a coherent subcategory of self-destructive power techniques. Seppuku costs a percentage of maximum health. Bloody Slash drains HP. Assassin's Gambit takes 35 flat HP. Blood Tax heals back in return. Even Raptor of the Mist begins by accepting an incoming blow. There is a thread running through all of these that distinguishes them from techniques that merely cost FP they require you to give something real, not just a resource bar that refills at any grace. Each self-damaging ash is asking the same question. How much of yourself are you willing to spend on the next attack? The Land of Reed's warrior who developed Seppuku apparently decided the answer was everything. Piercing throw and scattershot throw. The DLC introduced a new category of throwing weapons called Smithscript weapons, and with them came dedicated ashes in piercing throw and scattershot throw. Piercing throw launches the weapon in a penetrating straight line, capable of hitting multiple enemies. Scattershot throw breaks the weapon into a spread of projectiles that fan outward. These two ashes represent completely new territory for the system. They are not adaptations of melee techniques onto throwing weapons. They are techniques designed specifically for this new category, built from scratch to reflect the physics and philosophy of a weapon that is meant to leave the hand. The DLC's addition of weapon-specific ashes for new categories reinforces a consistency in the game's design logic. Every weapon tradition that enters the game should, eventually, develop its own preserved memories. Vacuum Slice, the Ash of War. Vacuum Slice fires a compressed arc of air at range, a technique that belongs to the cutting at a distance tradition practiced by a handful of moves across the entire game. The physical type ashes are generally the most affinity flexible, compatible with the largest range of affinities through wet blade modification. And Vacuum Slice is among the broadest in this regard. The idea that a sufficiently precise and powerful swing of a weapon can project its cutting energy forward through empty air is a fundamental piece of the combat philosophy in worlds like this one, where the boundary between physical and magical technique is not a wall, but a gradation. Vacuum Slice exists just inside that boundary. Technically a physical technique, technically a ranged attack, belonging fully to neither category. Square Off, the Ash of War. Square Off is found on a Teardrop scarab on the hill at Siofra River, the underground world of the Eternal City, where ancestral spirits hunt by moonlight. Square Off is a two-stage technique. You enter a stance, and then your next attack is either a rising slash that launches small enemies, or a launching thrust depending on the input. The patience built into this ash, the standing and waiting, the read of what is needed, makes it unusual in a roster full of ashes that reward aggression. Square Off asks you to stop, assess, and commit to the precise correct response. That it is found in Siofra River, a place of stillness and ceremony, where the ancestral spirits perform their rituals with quiet repetition across an underground sky, feels fitting for a technique that rewards watching before striking. Flail Skill and the Mounted Dead. The Knight's Cavalry, who wield the Knight Rider flail, carry a weapon whose default skill involves whirling the flail overhead in a wide arc that applies blood loss build-up on contact. This is the only weapon in their arsenal that applies a status effect, and it makes the flail-wielding cavalry distinctly more dangerous than their glaive-carrying counterparts over sustained engagements. The flail's whirling overhead attack is not an Ash of War in the traditional sense. It is a locked skill of the weapon itself, not transferable. But it demonstrates something important about the Knight's Cavalry's design. The varied combat profiles across the 10 patrol bosses are intentional. Each of the 10 carries a different threat profile, a different damage type, a different reason to engage them with a different strategy. They are not a uniform faction. They are a collection of individuals who happen to serve the same Dark Rider. Overhead, stance. The DLC's Ash of War. Overhead stance puts the character into a high, two-handed raised posture and delivers a crashing downward strike that concentrates the weapon's full mass into the narrowest possible point of impact. It is the opposite of the wide arc. Instead of covering area, it commits everything to one precise descent. Overhead, stance pairs naturally with weapons that already reward commitment. Colossal axes, heavy greatswords, curved greatswords that have the weight to make the descent meaningful. The stance itself, held over the head, stationary for a moment, is the most vulnerable position in the game, completely exposed, offering nothing to the sides. It is a technique that bets everything on the opponent being exactly where you predict them to be when the hammer falls. Seppuku and the Lord of Blood's exaltation. When you activate the Ash of War, Seppuku, you inflict blood loss on yourself. The game treats this exactly as it treats blood loss inflicted on you by an enemy. It counts as a hemorrhage event. This means that the Lord of Blood's exaltation talisman, which grants a 20% attack power increase whenever blood loss occurs in your vicinity, triggers on your own Seppuku activation. If you are also wearing the white mask, which grants a further 10% attack increase when blood loss occurs near you, both buffs fire simultaneously. The result is a 30% flat damage increase that you can apply at the beginning of any encounter simply by plunging your sword into your own stomach and letting the blood flow. It is a technique of deliberate self-harm, weaponized so precisely that the pain becomes indistinguishable from preparation. Power stancing and the duplicate ash. The power stancing system in Elden Ring allows you to wield two weapons of the same category simultaneously, pressing the two-handed attack button to trigger a simultaneous dual weapon moveset. Combined with the duplication system for Ashes of War, wherein lost Ashes of War allow Hewg to reproduce any ash you already own, it becomes possible to apply the same Ash of War to both weapons in a power stance pair. This means both weapons share the same skill, both weapons share the same affinity, and when you activate the ash, it applies to both simultaneously. For techniques like Seppuku, which applies a bleed buff to the weapon it is on, duplicating the ash and applying it to both weapons in a dual katana setup allows you to buff both blades before an encounter. The two-handed button input can then trigger both applications in sequence. It is the most deliberate exploitation of the duplication system's stated lore purpose, making one genuine thing into two. Two-handing and the hidden bonus. There is a mechanical interaction that a significant portion of the player base never fully internalizes. Two-handing any weapon in Elden Ring multiplies your effective strength by 1.5 for the purpose of meeting requirements and for scaling calculations. This means that even when you are using an Ash of War's skill, which is activated with the left trigger regardless of stance, you benefit from the two-handed bonus if you are two-handing the weapon. The difference is not enormous in absolute terms, but for ashes that scale their skill damage with strength, like Ground Slam or Prelate's Charge, the two-handed modifier provides a measurable additional output that most players leave untapped. The game does not announce this interaction prominently. It is one of those mechanical truths that reward players who read carefully and test systematically. Occult affinity's counterintuitive logic. The occult affinity, unlocked by the Black Wet Blade, behaves in ways that consistently confuse players encountering it for the first time. When you apply occult affinity to a weapon with innate bleed, say an Uchikatana, the base bleed build-up number on the weapon actually decreases compared to the blood affinity version. This feels like a downgrade. It is not. The occult affinity simultaneously makes the weapon's status build up scale with your arcane stat, meaning that at high arcane, the bleed buildup from an occult weapon significantly exceeds what a blood-infused version achieves despite the lower base number. Additionally, ashes like Seppuku, when applied to an occult-infused weapon, scale their additional bleed buildup with arcane as well. The system rewards those who understand its mathematics and punishes those who read only the visible stat on the item description. This is arguably the most misunderstood number in all of Elden Ring's build system. Cold Affinity's upgrade multiplier. The Cold Affinity applied through the glintstone wet blade has a mechanical property that distinguishes it from most other affinities. It lowers the weapon's base attribute scaling at lower upgrade levels, but increases the scaling upgrade multiplier, meaning the weapon's damage output grows faster per smithing stone applied as you push it toward the upgrade ceiling. A standard Zweihander at plus 25 has strength and dexterity scaling of D and C respectively. A cold Zweihander at plus 25 has C and C. The Cold Affinity's growth curve catches and surpasses alternatives that look better at lower upgrade levels. This makes cold weapons uniquely optimized for players who commit to full upgrading rather than spreading smithing stones across multiple weapons. And it makes the glintstone wet blade's discovery a milestone that rewards patience over immediacy. FP cost disparities across the ashes. The FP costs of ashes of war span an enormous range, and the gap between the cheapest and the most expensive says something interesting about how the game values different categories of technique. Quick Step, the basic repositioning step sold by Nightburnal for 800 runes, costs 0 FP to activate. You can use it indefinitely as long as you have stamina. Raptor of the Mist costs 0 FP on entering the stance and only 6 FP when the activation actually triggers. At the other extreme, more elaborate elemental skills like Black Flame Tornado cost 30 FP per use. The most expensive skills in the game can drain a significant portion of a player's FP pool in 2 or 3 uses, which makes FP management a genuine strategic consideration. The cheapest skills, being essentially free, can be used as liberally as the game allows. The range suggests a deliberate design philosophy. Simple techniques should feel accessible, while power has a price. Somber stone weapons and the hard wall. Weapons upgraded with somber smithing stones. The upgrade path for unique, named weapons and boss drop armaments cannot receive any Ash of War whatsoever. No skill, no affinity, no modification. The skill they have when you find them is the skill they will always have. This is the trade-off. Somber upgraded weapons typically have higher base damage, more unique visual designs, and boss-specific movesets that cannot be replicated elsewhere. The Blasphemous Blade, the Rivers of Blood, the Moon Veil. All somber weapons, all locked to their innate skills. To use one of these weapons is to accept that skill and commit to it entirely, forever. It is the game's most direct statement about specialization. The unique weapons that carry the most individual identity are the ones that cannot be reshaped. You use them as they are, or you use something else. Native affinity versus wet blade. Override. Every Ash of War has a native affinity, a default elemental or damage scaling type that it applies when you use it without any wet blade influence. Bloody Slash's native affinity is blood. Hoarfrost Stomps is cold. Thunderbolts is lightning. But with the appropriate wet blade in your inventory, you can override this native affinity with any compatible alternative from that wet blade's options, keeping the Ash's skill while changing the weapon's damage type and scaling entirely. This means you can carry Hoarfrost Stomp's skill on a blood affinity weapon, or Bloody Slash's skill on a quality affinity weapon. The skill and the affinity are, ultimately, separate things occupying the same slot. The ash provides one, the wet blade overrides the other. Understanding this separation is what makes truly flexible builds possible. It is the difference between using the system and mastering it. Weapons that come pre-equipped. Several weapons in the game arrive with ashes of war already slotted, and some of these ashes are otherwise impossible to obtain naturally. The Nagakeba, the long katana dropped by Bloody Finger Hunter Yura, or found in the Murkwater Cave, comes pre-equipped with the Ash of War, Piercing Fang, despite the fact that its actual base skill, when the ash is removed, is unsheathed. This means the Nagakiba is carrying an ash that belongs to a different tradition than the one it was built around. The Piercing Fang can be stripped off, used, or duplicated via lost ashes of war. In the DLC, the backhand blade comes similarly configured, pre-equipped with Blind Spot as both its native ash and its underlying base skill simultaneously. These pre-equipped ashes serve as the game's mechanism for ensuring players have access to every technique in the roster, even if they cannot find the scarab or complete the quest that would normally yield it. The Tarnished is a collector of the dead. There is a philosophical through line to the entire Ash of War system that only becomes visible when you step back and look at the whole of it. Every Ash of War is either pulled from the body of a defeated enemy, taken from a creature that was carrying it, purchased from an NPC with access to old techniques, or found in a place where someone who knew the skill once lived or died. You never create an ash. You only inherit one. The Tarnished does not develop new techniques across the course of their journey. They accumulate the final moments and deepest skills of everyone they encounter and defeat. The Round Table Hold is a gathering of Tarnished supported by the grace of an absent god, and at the center of it sits Hewg with his forge, capable of duplicating memories so that one inheritance can become two. The whole system is a meditation on what it means to come to a world in ruins and build something from what it left behind. You arrive with nothing. You leave carrying the fighting knowledge of hundreds of dead warriors, and you fight with it as though it were always yours. The ash that costs you nothing. The cheapest ash in the entire game is fittingly the one that requires no commitment at all. Quickstep. Purchased from Knight Bernal at the Warmaster's shack in Limgrave for just 800 runes, Quickstep does exactly what its name says. A rapid repositioning step that circles around a locked-on target. It costs 0 FP per use. There is no resource expenditure beyond stamina. It is the baseline of evasion, the barest expression of the idea that a skilled fighter can always find a way to not be where the attack is landing. For new players struggling with the game's aggression, Quickstep on any melee weapon is a meaningful upgrade over the base dodge roll, more targeted, more controllable. The fact that the game's most mechanically accessible ash is also its cheapest feels like a genuine gift placed near the start of the journey. The ash that makes you flinch the least, the Ash of War, Endure, found on a scarab in the lands between, reduces the flinching your character experiences when struck, drastically increasing poise while active. For players using large, slow weapons that have long attack animations and high commitment windows, Endure allows those animations to complete even while absorbing incoming hits that would normally interrupt them. It is not flashy. It does not summon storms or imbue your blade with frost. It simply makes you harder to stop. In a game that frequently punishes stubbornness, Endure is the mechanical argument that sometimes the correct answer is to not move. to stand in the fire, finish the swing, and trust the numbers. Sacred Order, the Ash of War. Sacred Order is noted in its description as the skill of the Golden Order fundamentalist knights, and the gesture it preserves, a sharp salute before granting the weapon holy essence, is the last surviving motion of an army that no longer exists. The Golden Order fundamentalists were the most doctrinally hardline faction of the Greater Will's earthly church, and their combat philosophy was inseparable from their theology. You did not bless your weapon. You performed a ritual acknowledgement of authority before going into battle. Sacred Order drops from a scarab northwest of the abandoned coffin site of Grace in southern Altus Plateau, and its presence in that particular part of the world, the roads between the legacy of the Golden Order's strongholds, feels like an echo still reverberating through a landscape that has otherwise moved on. Every ash is allowed in player trade. One of the less celebrated facts about ashes of war is that they are permitted in the online player trade system. You can drop an ash of war from your inventory for another player to pick up, and they can do the same for you. This means that ashes locked behind difficult encounters, quest lines with branching outcomes, or specific playthrough conditions are all accessible through cooperation. A player who killed Edgar can share his spinning strikes with a player whose arena questline went differently. The only exception involves ashes obtained through player trade from another character. If the ash did not originate naturally in your world, it will not appear in the duplication menu with Hewg. The system acknowledges the distinction between what you earned and what someone gave you. Both are real, but only what you earned can be reproduced. A tarnished who understands. By the time you have equipped your 125th Ash of War, by the time you have hunted invisible scarabs across frozen lakes and rooftops and flooded swamps, defeated cavalry that appeared only in darkness, spoken to a grieving murderer in a remote shack and taken the technique from his cooling hands, you understand something about the lands between that the main story never states directly. This world was full of skill. Before the shattering, before the rot and the war and the withdrawal of grace, there were warriors across every corner of the map who spent their lives mastering something. A parry, a thrust, a spinning arc of cold magic, a forbidden cut of the stomach. They are all still here. Not in their bodies, those are dust or monsters or neither, but in the memory of the motion preserved in these small bright fragments, waiting to be carried forward. The tarnished journey is, in its most literal sense, an act of remembrance. You pick up what everyone else dropped and you carry it to the end.